Welcome to the Security Cloud Podcast with the host, Lars Kamp.
And we're back here with Jonathan Rau. Jonathan is a distinguished engineer at Query. And in episode 1, we talked obviously about what Query is doing and different data formats and cybersecurity, specifically the open cybersecurity schema framework that Query is using and contributing to. But in the intro in episode 1, we talked about everything that Jonathan has previously done, which is he's worked at cybersecurity startups. He worked at AWS, was a technical account manager for AWS Security Hub. So you've worn all hats, Jonathan: product management, engineering, building CISO, everything. And this is what this episode is going to be about. You've also developed your own open source CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management. And actually, it's a little bit more than that, too. So the product is called Electric Eye. And Jonathan, why don't we what is Electric Eye? What does it do? How did you come up with the idea? Are you still using it?
Yeah, for sure. So Electric Eye at its root was just kind of an extension to AWS Security Hub. When Security Hub came out, all the controls in it were sourced from config, and AWS config is kind of a configuration management CMDB type tool, but only supported what you would call the vanilla services in AWS, if you would, the EC2s, the EBS, the RDS, S3, Dynamo, but it didn't have a lot of support for anything else. And when I built Electric Eye, I'm like, well, Security Hub's already good at CIS benchmarking, and it's good at these services, except it's not looking at everything that's possible for them, digging into like the different schema extensions and parameters for RDS to see if things are SSL. And it's definitely not looking at, kind of oddball services or services that are widely used but not supported by config. And at the time, it was like SQS and SNS, Neptune, Elasticache. And that's how it started. It was a set of Python scripts that were very badly written because I only learned how to write Python as an AWS, which is a good and bad place to learn where to write Python, because it's good that, hey, you have all the resources, and it's bad that the bar raisers treat you as if you're an expert, right? So there's a higher code standard. And that's how it started off, just writing a ton of Python scripts that would go out and hit these APIs, pull this data back. And at the time, I was building it around Security Hub, where like, hey, the data gets sent to Security Hub. It's like, why not? I just came from there. It's going to be the centralization store for AWS. There's 30 tools at the time that were integrated to it, plus the AWS services. And it was using the ASFF that we helped develop at AWS, the Amazon Security Finding Framework, or finding format rather, that had normalized fields with its own rules. It wasn't as big as OCSF. And that's really how Electric Eye kind of went on. But there's other more popular tools out there. I know Tony De La Fuente very well from Prowler. He's coming out with Prowler V4. God bless that guy. He's got $6 million in the bank seed for Prowler Pro up in the cloud. That's been through multiple iterations. I remember him talking to him about the idea at Forward CloudSec 2022, maybe, that we met, and he was thinking about the idea. So to see him execute on that is awesome, right? So even in its earlier state, Prowler was a lot better because it was a lot more adaptable. It had multi-account support, multi-region support. And Electric Eye was like, well, you could run multiple containers and orchestrate them across that. Security people were like, that's dumb. I don't want to do all that. So that's how it began. And then now it's a little bit something different. I call it a CSPM plus an SSPM, even though is SSPM really different than CSPM because SaaS is cloud, is it not? And then an EASM, an external attack surface management tool. So it has Nmap. I'm coming up with some ZAP support, virus total support, a little bit of CISA for like vulnerability support inside of it. It has still to this day the leading amount of AWS support. I mean, I leaned in heavy to just support pretty much every service. I mean, freaking Elastic Transcoder and Neptune and all sorts of like oddball MemoryDB, Cassandra inside of it. It has GCP support, only a tiny bit of it. I'm working on Azure right now. It has a lot of Oracle Cloud support, like 200 plus checks to Oracle Cloud. And it also supports pretty much every security benchmark that you could do for Salesforce. A decent bit of it for M365 if you have an E5 or an E3 or an F2 license, or is it F3? And a little bit for Salesforce, because when I was developing Salesforce, they went and switched how they did authentication. So I kind of got frustrated by that and stopped. If you use any of those platforms. If you want to centralize, it's multi-account, multi-region for all the cloud providers, and then multi-tenant for if you, for some reason, had two M365 tenants. It does normalize to
Mhm.
OCSF. It sends it to Security Hub. It also uploads to Postgre, Mongo, DocDB, Aurora. You could dump it out at HTML, CSV, multiple JSON formats, and then it has full-blown support in AWS for all the partitions as well. So China
Oh, yeah,
region,
that's a good point. China region,
yeah,
GovCloud,
China
right?
region, GovCloud, and as well as all three of the isolated regions. So ISO B and ISO E, and then it's not ISO C. I should know this off the
Yeah.
top of my head, but pretty much the secret, top secret intelligence community clouds, which are more private cloud, and then as well as a sovereign cloud in Europe for MI6.
Yeah, I just posted about that on LinkedIn about the different partitions because we had to do this. We found out the hard way too with Fix, where we had to support the China partition because someone pinged us like, "Hey, this is not working on China." But why? Explain to the listeners, why does that matter? Like, when is it important that a CSPM supports all the different AWS partitions? And
Yeah,
by the
so
way, there's another one
AWS,
for Europe. There's actually another one for Europe, right? There's like the equivalent of the high security, whatever it's called,
yeah,
right?
there's
There's an
ISO
equivalent for
E, and then they have ISO
yeah.
F now, and I just added support for that. I saw it appear. It's weird. The Go SDK usually gets all of these endpoints first. So I believe ISO E is going to be the UK soft MI6 cloud, kind of like ISO and ISO B. And then ISO F, I believe, is European sovereign cloud.
So I'll have you talk about the partitions, but also now we're looking at the GitHub repo for Electric Eye and how it works. But I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. We can go back to this. But let's talk about why does it matter for CSPM to support these different partitions in AWS, and then we'll go back to how Electric Eye works, the architecture, how you store data, all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So AWS being kind of the first cloud, right? A lot of people adopted it a lot more, and they still have a significant lead to this day over Azure, GCP, and of course everybody else, and the pack OCI, Linode, OVF or OVH, and Alibaba and
Oh,
whatnot,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So when they set up the partitions, partitions are like completely separate forks you could think of AWS. Everything, because at AWS it goes back to that meme where it's the two astronauts and one has a Colt 1911 pointed at the other, and it's like, wait, it was all colos, and then it's like it always has been. That's really what AWS is, right? Like the commoditized with economies of scale and incredibly skilled labor, all the networking, all the data, the compute, the storage, the security. Try to break into a freaking AZ at AWS. You're gonna have a bad
Mhm.
day. And then it was Amazon already, so they had a ton of money to bankroll. They had favorable tax credit or favorable tax status, existing business with like chambers of commerce in the different states and of course different countries around the world. But then when you go to operate in China, it's a little bit different. You have the Great Firewall, the party, right? The CCP has their own kind of rules and regulations. Everything is not everything, but a vast majority is nationalized or at least at some level owned by the state because, well, it's a little bit of a socialist system, right? Don't want to get too much into
Yeah.
the politic there. But,
Mhm.
with that comes like, hey, you want to operate here, you play by our rules, right? One in Rome, or I guess one in Shenzhen or Beijing in their case, right? I think that's where the two China regions are.
Mhm.
So it's a completely different fork of AWS essentially. Each region is managed by its own kind of state-owned or state proxied company. You have ViaNet, and I forget what the other one was called, and they own and operate all of it. You have to have special permission to actually use AWS China. Like it's easier as a U.S. citizen, at least, to start up a GovCloud instance than it is to start up a China instance. And it's only for business in China. And with that comes different rules. Not all the services are supported there because building the services, AWS services are built on other AWS services, and there's just the economy, the skill. It's completely different there, so that's why it's not a one for one copy. The partition naming is different. Encryption behaves a whole lot different because they have to be able to look at it, right? But part of the Great Firewall, the networking stack is a tiny bit different underneath the covers, not to the user. So if you wanted to have a business or a SaaS tool in China, you got to use the China region. Now, you could, in recent times, you could kind of skirt around that using Hong Kong or using the other APAC regions. But, if you have like a writ of business in China, you have to do it there. It's impossible, right? Like, you just can't give the account number. Like, it's completely isolated. Like, there's
Yeah.
no routing from AWS unless it was like public, but that, if you had like a public EC2 running in China, that's an IP address, but there's no like data plane routing. There's no awareness of one or the other. It's a completely different entity within Amazon, of completely different people. GovCloud's the same way. GovCloud came next. That was more for, kind of, confidential information sort of thing, even though you can, I think, run up to secret, though that depends. Like, the US loves its regulations and its laws almost as much as China does, but for different reasons. Maybe it's not state owned, but there's different compliance and regulatory standards that you have to meet. So GovCloud was created for that, where the government, the different agencies, I think there's 19 federal intelligence agencies, and there's another probably 15 regular federal law enforcement and federal enforcement agencies, plus DOD and the different departments and other combatant commands, joint combatant commands, and special operation combatant commands. They wanted a place where that had ITAR compliance, where, hey, the encryption is not going to leave, the data is sovereign, it's not going to leave these data centers, we're going to pick the sites, we're going to pick people at AWS that have clearances to work on them. So there's a higher information assurance there, and that's what GovCloud is about. If you're a US citizen, for the most part, AWS doesn't really care too much for you opening up a GovCloud tenant. But again, it's a completely different account. When you sign in, it's a lot different. They don't use root user there. It's an admin. There's, again, certain services that just don't work there. CloudFront's one of them, actually. Like, if you want to run CloudFront, you have to start it up in US East 1 and then also set the routes like as an external route into GovCloud. So there's some, variation there. And again, the partition thing is different. If you hard code like AWS as part of your ARN, it wouldn't work. It should be AWS US-US-gov, and then AWS-CN, and then the ISO regions. Well, it was talked about in the WikiLeaks.
The lesson learned is that if I run in more than one partition, then my tooling needs to work in more than one partition.
It needs to be aware of the partition at least. And for the most part, as long as you're using AWS SDKs underneath and you're not hard coding ARNs, especially like if you have to interpolate ARNs, as long as you're using that partition information, it'll work. CloudFormation is pretty good at it. Like, you'll see like the AWS partition pseudo operator, Boto3. That's what I use, right? I'm a Python dev. The Go SDK, Node, Rust, whatever you use, they're all aware. Like, they're all aware of the endpoints, because at the end of the day, those different partitions have their own DNS. They have their own networking backbone. So there is ways to be aware that you run there. Same thing for the ISO regions. Like, it'll work there. The ISO regions are even nuttier. To be fair, I don't know how ISO E or ISO F works, but ISO and ISO B, which is weird, they did top secret, then they did secret. So I think ISO is the top secret, and ISO B is the secret region. Those are for like actual DoD classification and of information up to top secret level. Then that comes with FedRAMP High, CMMC, and IL, I think 7 as well. But it's pretty much that, like, hey, we've blessed this, that the infrastructure, the people working on it, the access parameters, they meet muster to be able to store top secret or special access program or sensitive compartmentalized information in case of ISO here. And we signed off on all the hardware that's used. Think back to like the actual, like, the gigabit switches, the physical hardware, the chips, the motherboards, the RAM, the CPU, the cooling, the freaking security services, and then the site selection is all for there. But for the most part, it's kind of a private cloud. It's, again, another fork that runs inside of CIA, inside of NSA for them. We used to refer to them as snow fort regions or snow castle regions inside of AWS. And that was just like, hey, that's the secret squirrel stuff. Completely different release train, completely sequestered off. You're essentially a government contractor, but same rules apply. Like, they have SDKs like we do. The access is a little bit different. It's X509 based, so kind of how AWS IAM Anywhere is now, right? You have to use certificates. There's certain types of software that could run there. They have an even smaller selection of services. But again, if you write a tool, but you're not going to deploy SaaS there. Well, not
Right.
how you normally would. They do consume SaaS, but they consume it in a completely separate way that I really can't. Well, I'm sure it's well known, but I'm not going to get into it because I don't want to misspeak or have my door kicked in.
Yeah.
But
the key takeaway is
no,
that these different partitions are different forks of AWS, and
right,
therefore and it may have different services, different APIs, right? And so it's just like your tooling needs to support that if you run in
exactly,
those different partitions. So
yeah,
I'm going to go back and share your GitHub repo here real quick. And I think this is a really nice overview of how it works. So you said you started with pulling in data from AWS Security Hub, right?
yeah.
And it's written in Python. What's this little evaluate enrich report? Where do you store data? Like walk us through this little chart here. Where does data come from? How do you collect the data? What do you do with it once you've collected it? And then what happens next?
Sure. So this has changed a little bit. If you actually want to open up the other fork, I think it's called CIS-AZ.
Yeah.
So on the left side is where you source information from. So Electric Eye, it uses as much as I can at least. Like M365, they get a little cute and use the request library, but I use the SDKs that are supported, the clients that are supported by the cloud provider. So Botto 3, Google API, Google Python API, OCI
Mm-hmm.
is what Oracle just calls theirs, and then the various Azure SDKs. For ServiceNow, I use PySnow. For M365, I'm using. Anyway, the whole idea is that I try to use clients to source out the data, and I'm pulling anything that's security relevant, right? So whether it's information about, is the service encrypted? Do you have logging turned on? Are you setting it up in high available ways, right? So anything that you could think
Mm-hmm.
of that's security relevant that you'd see in the CSPM, that's what I'm assessing. And then on the SaaS side, I try to go off of like their best practices. So ServiceNow has an entire section dedicated to every single security knob you could turn inside of Snow. And I think I support everything that you can look at programmatically inside of ServiceNow. From 365, it's a bit different because that's really an amalgamation of a bunch of different things inside of Entra ID or Azure AD, inside of privileged identity management, inside of identity protection, inside of
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So I'm just looking for high level information there. Salesforce, same thing, like how things are configured, their different transactional security policies, TSPs. So I grab all that information. I actually had folks from Firemon help me rewrite Electric Eye to a V2. So it has a central kind of controller that
Mm-hmm.
you pass it a set of arguments, give it what provider you want. You could even specify what checks you want to write, the output format, and then it runs all the checks. That enrichment layer or attack surface monitoring, as I call it, that's all transparent to the user. So I'm using those services underneath the covers. You have to provide a key for some of them, so VirusTotal and Shodan. But for, let's say, an EC2 finding, I'm looking to see, is the EC2 public facing in the internet? And then if so, is it indexed by Shodan, and what does Shodan show to you? For
Mm-hmm.
CISA Kev, there's ECR, right? Amazon Elastic Container Registry, or OCR, Oracle Container Registry. There could be vulnerability data, and then it's checking like, hey, are any of these vulnerabilities known exploitable? If it's on CISA Kev, like you got to patch it, or you got to try to mitigate it. For things that store hashes, right, like AWS Code Artifact or Oracle Cloud Artifact Registry, OCAR, I use VirusTotal to be like, hey, are you accidentally, hiding anything in here that's actually a malware or a lull bin or something like that? I have an attack
Mm-hmm.
surface check that looks for those public services. Are they internet reachable on these dangerous ports like Samba and Postgre and SSH and RDP? That doesn't necessarily mean that you will get attacked there, but it's just like a good hygiene function to say, hey, did we misconfigure really anything in the network stack, right? Because Nmap is looking at it
Mm-hmm.
from the internet eye view, like Shodan. So if you had a WAF or network firewall or something misconfigured along the way, Nmap would be able to find that. And then the other symbol there for Yelp is their detect secrets. So if you have any secrets stored in plain text inside of like a Lambda runtime or code build, and then from
Oh,
there
okay.
you have the reporting options. I have built-in HTML reports that have a per service and an aggregated compliance view. I support over 25 different compliance checks that are all cross-walked from NIST 853. I'm not a compliance expert. I map them myself for security perspective, but pretty much any government related thing or any of the other big ones, CIS, PCI, I don't have high trust yet, CMMC, things like that, I have support for. So you can get that report, but that's built into all the other data formats as well. So it's normalized within ASFF and OCSF. So I have various outputs for that. You want it in JSON, ASFF. If you want it in OCSF, you could send it to AWS Document DB, Mongo, Postgre, Aurora, RDS, or your own flavor like Azure SQL and whatnot. You could send them. I have a Slack app. I also support Security Hub and Firemount Cloud Defense still to this day. And then if you just wanted to move it to a warehouse or a lake house, you could also send it to Kinesis Firehose.
And how is it? So, okay, so it's like evaluate, enrich, and report. And how is Electric Eye? Prowler Pro, obviously, but there's a bunch of CSPMs.
Yeah.
How is it? We talked about partitions and everything. How is it different now? How should a user think about picking a CSPM? And who's using Electric Eye? Lots of questions. I'll let you talk.
User wise, like I use it, right? I use my tool. I'm still actively developing it as I have time. Who's using it? From what I could tell, at least on GitHub, I mean, I've had all sorts of companies look at it from, I don't know if I can name them, but hey, you have people there that looked at it, right? At Atlassian, at BlackRock, CDC, HHS, DHS. I don't even know. I can't really keep track. I know there's a couple other open source tools that actually, or not open source tools, other SaaS tools that use Electric Eye to provide security services because it's licensed under Apache. When it first came out, it was under GPL3, but then I just decided to change the license because I'm like, well, I was the only contributor and nobody was using it because of the GPL license, I didn't mean it to discourage open source users. I just try to discourage people from, forking it and then using it for their own SaaS tools, which it didn't prevent anyway. I'm like, well, I'm just some guy. I can't afford to litigate it anyway, and who knows if I'll win, so who cares? It's Apache now. Maybe one day I'll get to do a pro version, but definitely not anytime soon. But as far as using it, so the key differentiator versus a giant like a Wiz or an Orca, or even a Lightspin, even though they're known as Cisco Panoptica now, versus a Prowler or a Scout Suite or anything else, is that I'm the only one to my knowledge that still has a self-deployable option. I know Wiz has Outpost and obviously there's Prowler, right? So, but that's a key differentiator. I support all the partitions, which isn't hard to support, right? I just have like a little library inside of it that, is able to check the endpoints, support the different partitions, manually set regions based on the partition, which is another, little part of it, right? Because you have the partition, then you have the region within the partition. You have to know which one that is. Otherwise, it won't work when you're like setting your ARNs. But since it's a self-deployed, self-contained option that you could containerize or not, if you're working at CIA or working on some TS stuff or working in UK sovereign, you could pick up Electric Eye and use it. It's not like your services can't be hit from the internet. It's harder to hit them, but there's still rigor that you have to meet. So that's the other one. And then I have the most support. And now I tried to build the checks with quality. And I've gone back and retired checks that don't make sense, right? Like checking bucket encryption. Every bucket's encrypted now in AWS. So retired that one.
Yeah.
Right. So I try to make sure that they're quality, security relevant checks. There's very few critical or high sort of things in there. It's supposed to be like an all encompassing, which is why I have the attack surface management there. It's the only one that I know of that has Oracle support, so I guess if you work for ByteDance, you should probably think about using it. Or I think there's a couple others. Anthropic maybe is on Oracle. And then I'm the only one that I know of that has SSPM support, right? So if you're using ServiceNow, if you're using M365, if you're using Salesforce, even if you're just using them on their own, you should probably use it. It's multi-count, multi-region, multi-org. It's pretty easy to configure. It uses a TOML file. Again, it's containerized. I maintain on Docker Hub, OCR, eventually ACR, but ECR, AWS. Docker images, you could pull the Docker file. I wrote it right. It's a multi-stage build. It uses its own user. It doesn't run as root. It's not privileged. So there's a bunch of different deployment options. And it's open source, it's transparent. You could see the source code, right? I'm not like launching reverse shells or doing anything crazy. And I think that's a big part of building trust, right? Where the SaaS tool, you have to trust that, like, okay, they're actually evaluating the right thing for me. Like, you could audit the code yourself. You could go in there to make sure that I'm actually looking, I'm pulling the right key value pair, I'm handling errors, bringing the data back. And then with the output options, you could pretty much put it anywhere. You could hydrate a lake,
Yeah.
a warehouse, you could put it in a DB, or you could put it back in another tool.
Yeah, open source in the, let's say in the general software engineering world, I think it's often thought about as a distribution method, right? Whereas
Yeah,
in cybersecurity, and including with what we do with Fix, we think about it as a trust factor, right? Like you
right,
can actually see how we do it, especially for checks, right? If you're, because at the end of the day, the result of a check is like either pass or fail, right? And
right,
so if I want to trust that result, then maybe it would be useful if I know how you wrote the check, right?
right.
And how you query the data. So in the repo, right? So you talk about cloud asset management. So all right, so you support these different cloud services providers, but then you specifically, and you have your checks, right? But you specifically talk about cloud asset management. Talk about that a little bit. Like, why is it relevant for cybersecurity? Because like the concept obviously comes up across every tool, but talk a little bit about CAM, cloud asset management. What does it do? Why does it matter?
Yeah, yeah, for
Mhm.
sure. So Cam was something that I just kind of came up with after seeing a Wiz demo. Honestly, I liked how they had their UI set up where you had your different categories like compute and analytics and storage. Then you would dig under that and then you would get it by provider. And then you would dig under that and you would get it by service, like within those categories. So I'm like, hey, an asset hierarchy would be cool to build into the tool. And ASFF and OCSF allow for that sort of like custom extension to define the category, the type, like, is it compute? What's the service that belongs to you, right? Because in the cloud, a service is not always one for one, right? Like EC2 is a perfect example. Technically, EC2 and on the API level covers VPC, it covers EBS, it covers Spot. But even if you just looked at it at like EC2 compute, you have EBS. Or on Azure, you have Azure VM, you have the Azure VM instance, you have the Azure VM disk, the Azure VM launch set, right? So that was kind of a way to organize it where my idea, was again flirting with the idea of doing either a self-managed sort of SaaS or maybe a professional SaaS, but to have that capability within there to fall into to have it. But overall, it's important because, I know ServiceNow and a couple other CMDBs try to have connectors, but they run into the same issue that we run into at Query, that anybody runs into at an ETL company, especially off the shelf ETL, that APIs change, things get retired, fields are missing, right? And it's hard to normalize and standardize on kind of a model. So that's what CAM was kind of out there for. I think it's only like 6 key value pairs that tell you the providers at SaaS are not who owns it, like what's the category, the class, and the actual component within that service. And it's just a really good way to organize out the asset details so you understand where everything is. Maybe you need this information for enrichment as part of investigation. Maybe you need to use it for FinOps or IT financial management. Maybe you want to have the data already partitioned like that to hydrate your lake or to actually put it in a traditional CMDB. It's important to keep track of it because a bunch of people need that data. Because at the end of the day, you have to pay for it and you have to secure it. But by that, like, you should know where stuff is if you're paying for it and you're on the hook for the security of it. And, that's why it's important. But to be fair, Electric Eye isn't a CAM tool necessarily. The CAM part is kind of like a thin veneer on top of it. If I don't write a check for it, I don't support it. So there are services out there that there's nothing to assess from a security aspect, like Amazon Bedrock or Amazon Recognition. There's really nothing that I could look at that makes any sense from like a
Mhm.
compliance or an auditing point of view or a security point of view. So I'm not just going to write a garbage check just for the sake of having it in there. So it's not like a full-fledged CAM versus, I think there's like Cloud Query and a couple in Steam Pipe from the folks at
Yeah.
Turbot. I think that probably have better example. I'm sure Fix has, a lot more support for services, right? So when I talked about before, like why use Electric Eye, it's like, oh, yeah, the most service support. And it's like most service support for security checks. Like if there's something in there it's something, in my opinion, having ran multiple cloud security teams and worked at cloud security startups, that I think is at least worthwhile looking at. And then the CAM is just a tiny bit of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, coverage is important, right? Because even though you may only be using, I don't know, like I'm making this up, like 8 or 10 AWS services, you know, an attacker might not, right? They
Right.
might, like, if you're an EC2 shop, they might spin up Lambda functions, right?
Yeah.
You should also, like, coverage means not only covering the services you use, but the services a third party that's not your friend might be using, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the other, the dual sidedness of the security. It's like knowing what you have to secure it, but also knowing when there's things out there that maybe you don't have a policy for. Like there's still companies out there that run that way, where it's like they have a technology risk business committee, and it's like, okay, we support you for using SageMaker and whatnot. Maybe it's because there's compliance regimes, right? Because AWS has their own audits for their own services, and some services don't meet
Mhm.
muster for certain DODIL levels or FedRAMP levels, or that don't fall, within the specifications of like the HIPAA security rule or the HIPAA high tech final rule to use. So that's one aspect of it, to make sure that, hey, I'm using something unsanctioned. But to your example, cryptojacking is one of the more ubiquitous cloud attack vectors out there, right? Like, sure, there's the
Yes.
initial access and the defense evasion, but once it's time for actions on the objective, yeah, there's ransomware, yeah, there's data exfiltration, yes, there's destruction, but mostly what I've seen, like real life live incidents, honeypots and whatnot, they just want to mine some Monero at your expense, and
Yeah.
they've gotten good at it, right? I remember the first Monero miners out there were like very obvious, and then now they're using Fargate, they're using EKS Fargate, they're using EKS, they're hiding them in code build, they're hiding them in AWS batch, they're running them as jobs on EMR. Like it's crazy out there. So that's the other part to your point, that hey, you should monitor all services, all assets, and then if you see something that makes the back of the hair on the back of your neck stand up, like, wait a minute, who's using EMR inside of the sandbox account? Like, probably worth investigating.
Yeah, yeah, because it's fine if it runs in the sandbox account. People are concerned about their production environment for obvious reasons, but if I'm just crypto mining, I'll do it anywhere I can, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
ideally in the place that no one's paying attention to, which is dev, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so then, okay, so talking about the CSPM landscape here, what you've done is you've built your own connectors, right, to AWS service, to the cloud providers. You've built your connectors to your SaaS platforms, ServiceNow, 365, Salesforce. You enrich by getting data in from different databases for your attack surface management. And then obviously there's the data output, so I can consume data where I want to consume it. You mentioned something about FinOps, and I want to ask you, have you observed a convergence between FinOps and security? And the reason I'm asking, like you pointed out, like, hey, you're running all these assets, you need asset management, and you need this data for different use cases, not just security, also for
Right.
FinOps. Have you seen this? I've seen anecdotes, but maybe
Yeah.
I'm just talking to a subset of people, and it's sort of self like selection bias.
A little bit. So I know Monty Cloud, the day two platform, has, I think their security agent still uses Electric Eye underneath, but they started more as like platform management, FinOps sort of tool. So what I see more than anything else is like Cloud Health, they became Secure State. Monty Cloud, then Apptio, IBM bought Apptio, and then Apptio bought Nycus Digital Fuel. That's an IT, that's like a pure play IT financial management. Like we're
Yeah.
talking general ledger, bill of materials, cost towers, cost pools. I used to do a little bit of consulting in that space. So that's another weird thing that I've done in
Mhm.
the past to add to all the other weird things. But I see those tools more just kind of adding them in kind of as an afterthought. Like, all right, we're already collecting all this information and we're rationalize it against the cur, right? Because like the cur, like the actual bill that you get, like your actual PO is the source of truth for financial. And if you're at a big place, you probably have a chief economist on staff, or at least somebody who understands how accounts
Yeah.
payable and receivables work. And then they're going to want to map that back to the asset. So I have seen it. And then IHS Market, we had the office of the CTO, Octo, who, on top of like technology business risk and overall just good enterprise and solutions architecture, they also did the FinOps piece of it, kind of shared responsibility
Mhm.
between the office of the CTO and the CIO. and we would source some data for them because, either they didn't have the skills
Yeah.
or the tooling that they were using didn't support everything. So we would use Electric Eye, even at IHS, and with our own connectors that we used to populate our own graph ontology, we would contribute data back to them, back to their own little data lake. They called it a data lagoon. It was built on Azure Blob
Data
Storage,
Lagoon,
which,
Data Swamp. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, at least they were funny
Something.
about it. They knew it was bad because they used Azure, but they used Azure because they had the Power BI connector, and they use that for their general
Yeah.
reporting for the cost management piece. But yeah, there's a slight convergence into it, and I think even Wiz now is trying to look into the cloud FinOps space, but FinOps it's a lot more than just like figuring out like, hey, this thing is running at this tier, right? Like there's variable services, enterprise discount programs, storage discount programs, AWS credits, tax rebates, value added tax. There's all sorts of other concerns for cost and FinOps versus just what tier do you pay at, right? So the cost
Yeah.
levers that you have to pull are a lot more nuanced, which is why I think there hasn't been success of security companies trying to move into the space because it's just not in our wheelhouse.
I'm thinking out here because I've seen it. What I've seen, one cloud security engineer actually put it nicely to me. It's like the best way to get rid of security. I'm paraphrasing, but one great way of getting rid of misconfigured resources and security risk is by simply deleting them. And you can best do that if they're not being used in the first place, right? And
Yeah.
that's sort of where the FinOps discipline comes in. And he threw out a number. It's like, in 40% of the cases, the resource that's misconfigured is not in use anyhow, And then I said, wait, is that? But feels about right.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
Eh, maybe, he then quickly said, "Oh, don't quote me on that," right? But yeah. So it's written in Python. Where do you store your data? Like, and how do I analyze my data? I mean, there's data, but like, what's the backend for Electric Eye? Let's talk the tech stack here.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like it's the own classes inside of it, whatever SDK that there is. If not, it's requests, and then just good old JSON or the CSV library, right? Like there's nothing to it. It's literally just like uncompiled Python. You could just run it locally. It's not
Mm-hmm.
using any crazy dependency, right? I think the craziest thing in there is matplotlib and pandas for some of the dashboarding. But other than
Mm-hmm.
that, it's pretty like much core library on top of SDKs. There's no Django, Celery, Redis, all the outputs, like they use their own SDKs, right? Like I use PyMongo and PyMySQL and
Yeah.
Scicot G2 binary, but that's just to facilitate moving the data there. I'm not actually pulling from that beyond it. So it's essentially kind of build your own stack. Like you could choose where to put the data. You could, dump it to JSON, upload it to S3, send it to the Firehose, send it to Snowflake, whatever you want to do.
Oh, okay. I'm getting you're not a database is not part of Electric Eye. Like you
No.
choose where to send the data,
Yeah.
right? Which could be any of the supported outputs here that you show
Yeah.
in your repo in your image. Understood. Okay. Yesterday there was a post on Hacker News about a new SOAR tool, Service Orchestration, Automation, and Response, and they got, I'm not going to say who it was because they got flamed out a little bit. They said like, hey, you should at least tell me how you're securing your own stack and your own product before you come to me to help me secure my stack.
Right.
And I thought it was really nice how you call that out at the bottom of your of the repo. If you like repository security, so maybe more generally, talk a little bit about security for a security tool. What
Yeah.
do you think? Obviously, you've done it here. Like, what is a good practice? What do you recommend for CSPM tool to do when it's open source and when it's SaaS?
Yeah. I think starting with the SaaS part, right? Having actually been a CISO, you know, I don't want to get into the whole compliance isn't security, and that's pretty much correct. Like there are legit security technology controls within compliance regimes, but starting there, it's all about building trust. And obviously, depending on your commercialization model, you may or may not want to actually publish SBOMs and publish source code, but the next best thing you could do is just be really public about what you have. Put up who your data
Mm-hmm.
subprocessors are. Maybe have
Mm-hmm.
a prefab DPA. Maybe you have your own like SIG core questionnaire that you already pre-filled out as much as you can. get an AWS FTR or the equivalent, hire like a competently staffed audit firm that has a great track record of good SOC 2 examinations that aren't going to be scared to give you exceptions and give you improvement plans within your review period. And then if it works for you, also, perhaps add ISO 27001 or 27017, right? Like, it doesn't have to be compliance paperwork, and that only goes so far. Just being as transparent as you can with your policies and how security operates. And then on the open source side, where the code's already out there, it's pretty easy just to get in the AppSec stack, right? Like, you should use, like in Python, PEP8 coding, abide by good coding standards to make the code readable and accessible to folks. I'm not going to get into the whole, like, should you comment or over comment or whatnot, but you definitely want to, make sure that you're actually using some coding standard and not just having things like all crazy, right? Like, towards performance, towards security. If you have a tool that's using like process popen or sub process, and you're actually doing things on the operating system, like, probably call that out, like, what does the tool do? And then to the AppSec tooling stack, I mean, it's pretty easy, right? Like, you could use Sneak for free. You could use Dependabot for free, right? That's built in. Just have Dependabot turned on. Then GitHub is really good at actually finding either secrets or secret stuff that gets printed out. Go through there. And then for me, I added, I have the Dependabot. I'm running CodeQL as well, which runs really slow because I have so much Python in there, and it doesn't really ever find anything because, again, it's just like a simple Python script, right? That essentially is looking at a specific method in a specific provider's SDK. But then you can build SBOMs, right? I don't particularly like them. I build one because I'm using a complex multi-stage build for the Docker file specifically. And it's a lot easier to actually build that Docker file with all the dependencies and then run the SBOM on top of it. But everything else, you could just use a pretty standard SCA tool, a software composition analysis tool like a Sneak, or I think OWASP has a depth checker, dependency checker, whatever they call it nowadays. There's a ton of stuff that you could do. And I just add that there. It's like, hey, I think SBOMs are a meme. I don't particularly like them. I think it's just extra security theater. One of the aspects that I think they're useful in is for multi-stage complex builds that have a ton of software composition and a crazy dependency tree like I do. Then it makes sense. And then I just make it as obvious as possible, right? Because some people might not know to look in the GitHub action outputs. It's like, hey, here's what I use. Here's what it's used for. Look at the report. And then I have Black and PyTest and a couple other things running in there. You want your software to be well documented, well tested. I think documentation is probably the better part of that, though. If you do nothing else, just make sure that you abide by somewhat of a code standard and document the hell out of your tool, because nobody's going to use it if you don't have it well documented. And with good documentation comes good explanation about what a system does. And I think it could connote some maturity, if not security, of a solution.
Yeah, documentation is just so fundamental, at the risk of stating the obvious. So all right, let's maybe talk about one more use case and wrapping up the cryptojacking use case. But Electric Eye is really great for companies that run in more than one part. I mean, it's great for any AWS user, but it's great for companies that run in more than one AWS partition that maybe have multi-cloud, also GCP and Azure or Oracle, who use SaaS tools, specifically ServiceNow. So it's very enterprisey. Microsoft 365 and Salesforce, and always like, who doesn't? Right. And then want to marry that data with attack surface management data, where you pull data in as well to enrich your data set, your raw data set that you collect, and then flexibly use it in a way that it fits my needs. Meaning, like, I can pick my data store. Is it S3? Is it a web doc? So that web document. So that's the differentiation that Electric Eye provides. Did I get a job here at
being
a
you
good
did
product
a better
marketer
job
for you?
of pitch. Yeah, you did a better product marketing pitch than I did.
I'm hired.
Yes.
Let's talk about the cryptojacking use case, maybe. How does it work, right? And how would you find out by using Electric Eye? And what would be the countermeasures? If we can wrap that up maybe in 5 minutes here.
Yeah, for sure. So cryptojacking is hijacking resources or hijacking an account to mine crypto. What it used to look like was folks would pull up an XMR miner binary or a Monero miner binary or even a Litecoin miner binary in some cases, and running it on a big chunky EC2 instance. So they would be able to mine pretty much for free using your resources, and it would cause you, paying either an economic denial of service or just, running up service credits or whatever it is. Now, typically there's multiple ways to find it. So Amazon Guard Duty and most of like the Defender for Cloud, and I think GCP Command Center, they're examining DNS and network like level 3, level 4 flow logs. And then they have a list that threat intelligence providers of all sorts have to be like, hey, this outbound connection is a XMR or Monero or whatever mining operation. So they get a little sneakier. They start to do reverse proxies. They use DGAs. They use black holes. They use a little bit of obfuscation. Maybe they fall onto existing resources if they can, where before is like, we want to get credentials, spin up resources. And then now it's like, okay, we're going to evolve. We're going to do what other attackers do and actually try to exploit network type vulnerabilities, identity type vulnerabilities on the asset, and then run it on top of the asset. So we're not actually creating infrastructure. Now, the ways you would typically find it are using a CSPM tool. It's multi-region by default. Electric Eye, you actually have to tell it to not be multi-region. If not, I'll try to run it in every region I can. And if you see a resource in a region that you don't typically use, that's probably your first indication that either somebody's just trying to do something like a demo, a little experiment, like, hey, let me just go outside in this own region, or it could be a cryptojacker, right? Like it's either or. It's either somebody's trying to, I guess, three things. It's benign activity, it's insider threat activity, exfiltrating data, or it's a cryptojacker, or maybe other things. But now they've gotten a lot better and a lot more skilled where they're running things on ECS containers. They're running them on Lambdas. They're running them on EMR serverless. They're running them on Glue data flow. They're running them on batch, and then equivalent services in GCP as well. A little bit of Azure. I haven't heard of any on Oracle, but I'm sure they exist as well. So the other way to catch it is like, I support all those services. So again, if you see something that you're not typically seeing, if you're an unsanctioned service, but really the best way is collecting the logs. If you're on Amazon, use Amazon Security Lake to centralize all that stuff for you. And you actually have to have a detection use case around it. Monitor that DNS activity to look for, clusters. I'm not saying that you have to use like isolation forest or random cut forest machine learning model or Z-score everything with like a Bayesian analytic model, but you should definitely be monitoring, that low level network stuff because they can't hide that. Even if they're using domain generation algorithms, DGAs or whatnot, or reverse proxies, like if it's not in your normal baseline, you should be able to find it. And that's where it's harder to intercept. So it's just use prevention when you can, use strong credentials, don't have temp creds running around, delete the VPCs in the other regions. There's default VPCs in every region. At the very least, delete them. So then when they go to create that infrastructure, you have a lot less stuff to look in CloudTrail, let's say, where if they want to use ECS or they want to use Fargate EKS, they're going to have to create a VPC. So maybe that's your alerting mechanism, or they create function, invoke function. And if it's in a region that you don't use or a function that you haven't seen before, right? Especially if you, let's say you backfill with Electric Eye, you run it 24 hours, and then the next day you see a function getting invoked. You look at wherever you're putting the Electric Eye finding, maybe you're doing a select resource name from Electric Eye database, and then where name equals this, and you're getting no results. It's like, well, that must have been created recently. Look in CloudTrail inside of Security Lake or CloudTrail Lake or your SIM, whatever, and then you'll be able to support that decision faster. Cryptojacking is a lot harder now, admittedly, to find just because there's so many different resources you could run it on. So you need a multivariate approach to be able to intercept it, interdict it, and eradicate it.
Right, but it still comes down to there needs something to run a compute job, right?
Oh, yeah. It has to have some compute somewhere, and that compute usually needs networking layer. So don't give them any lateral movement ability. Don't give them an area that they can execute easy. Delete the damn VPCs, use SCPs if you can to lock down regions, which is hard. And then prevention on other clouds is also difficult. In Oracle, they force you to run in only one region unless you spend a lot of money. So maybe move your workloads to Oracle. Yeah. So they get stuck in there with you. Don't actually do that. For the record.
Okay, this is, I think this was a hands-on example, right? And so the lesson learned is like, okay, you need to figure out if you have any assets that shouldn't exist but do exist, right?
Right.
A type of asset, like you're not running Fargate, like all of a sudden you have a Fargate function. Is that the proper word? Fargate function? Or
Yeah.
uh
Fargate. Yeah,
yeah,
I guess it depends
yeah,
what it is. Fargate task
it's
or
running
service.
Fargate task. Yeah. Like why is that? Like that shouldn't be there.
Right.
Like number one. Number two, there's activity in regions where there shouldn't be any activity, right? And so
Yeah.
that's where CSPM assets in the region, that's where CSPM comes in. Jonathan, I think so people obviously we're going to put the link to Electric Eye into the show notes so people can check it out. We mentioned on the previous episode, on episode 1, how people can reach you on LinkedIn. We're going to put that to the show notes as well. Wrapping up, any high level recommendation for anyone who wants to get started with the CSPM in general and specifically for Electric Eye, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say that you could probably put Electric Eye up against any CSPM CNAP out there. And if you're finding more value with Electric Eye, or the CNAP doesn't support it, or it's not as fast, like that's probably a bad thing. There's no reason that little old mini inline tool made of Jank Python should be outperforming a mainline tool. Maybe it won't, but I think it's good to use as kind of a backstop. It's a free option, and then if you're running in a compartmentalized region or you don't want to consume extra SaaS, you could also use it, right? Like it's free. It's Apache 2. You deploy it yourself in any mechanism you want. You want to run on Kubernetes, on VDI, whatever. You just go out and do that, and then also, maybe talk with your FinOps team as well to see, right? Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
they might find some use in it, and that's another vector, I guess, to close on cryptojacking, where maybe they're using everything. They're using an existing VPC. Maybe they're using your tagging parameters, but maybe the resources are just a little higher than you normally use. You're rocking T3 mediums and they got a C5 2XL, right? So there's other use cases
Yeah.
to find it, but I'd appreciate people use it. Maybe open a PR, open up an issue. Azure support, I'm not going to promise when, but it is coming. I'm up to 100 checks or so in my branch. I want to just get it done because I don't particularly like Azure. I'll be looking to do Alibaba and Linode sometime in the future, and then adding Snowflake support and Google Workspace support on the SaaS side.
Nice. Data security posture management. I like it. Jonathan, thank you so much. This episode was about Electric Eye. We had episode 1 where you covered your work at Query. And, this is your own little project with Electric Eye, building a CSPM. I love the cryptojacking example. Jonathan, thank you so much. We'll put everything to the show notes and we'll talk soon.
All right, awesome. See you around, Lars. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
The Security Cloud podcast brought to you by Fix.